Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses. Discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith is day 88. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 54 and 55 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the distinction of habits and of the virtues as to their essence. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code Summa 10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether many habits can be in one power. The simplest way to go about this question is to begin with the following words from Aquinas. The intellect cannot understand several things at the same time actually, and yet it can know several things at the same time habitually. So a man must either be thinking about geometry or metaphysics or chemistry, cannot consider each of them actually and individually at the same time, but he can possess knowledge of them all at the same time. He can have the habitual knowledge of them all. And since habits are distinguished by their corresponding objects, like powers are, remember we distinguish sight from hearing because the object of one is color and the object of the other is sound, then as objects of our habits are different in their kind from one another, so will the respective habit be. For example, the knowledge of first principles, upon which all other knowledge is built, the habit of understanding, is a different kind of known thing than the certain conclusions which flow from those principles, which are contained under the habitual knowledge of science. Temperance and courage are just not the same thing, which we will spell out later in the Summa. Neither is the quality we call health and the virtue of faith. All of these are kinds of habits in their own right and do merit being properly distinguished one from the other. So going back to our article, many habits can be in the same faculty, just as many different kinds of acts can come from the one and same faculty. And just as there is diversity in acts, there can also be diversity in dispositions to act. And those dispositions are what we have called, within the category of quality, habits. Article 2, whether habits are distinguished by their objects. Aquinas' response to this article is very similar to what we have said already. He writes, acts differ in species or specific kind according to the diversity of their objects, but habits are dispositions to acts. Therefore, habits also are distinguished according to the diversity of objects. Pretty simple, and in general, St. Thomas tells us that habits are distinguished by 3 factors. First, their active principles or the faculties and acts which have brought about this stable disposition we call a habit. Second, the nature of the habit, whether it be directed to the good or ill of the subject and to the subject's actions, i.e. whether it be a virtue or a vice, and whether it be a natural habit or a supernatural habit. Third, the object of the habit. What is this particular habit about? Is it about first principles, such as in the habit of understanding, or is it about certain conclusions which flow from those principles, what we have called the habit of science? Article 3, whether habits are divided into good and bad. Habits are divided into good and bad insofar as they are essentially suitable or unsuitable to our nature. The vice of intemperance is not suitable to our nature, the rational animal, because it is not advantageous to contemplation, since we are rational, and not advantageous to our physical health as animal. Habits can also be distinguished insofar as they are proportionate or above our nature, or supernatural, such as the natural knowledge of God by reasoning from effect to cause would be different from the knowledge of Him engendered by Him in the habit of faith. In regard to this distinction, St. Thomas writes, habits are distinguished in relation to nature, from the fact that one habit disposes to an act that is suitable to a lower nature, while another habit disposes to an act befitting a higher nature. And thus human virtue, which disposes to an act befitting human nature, is distinct from godlike or heroic virtue, which disposes to an act befitting some higher nature. Article 4, whether one habit is made up of many habits. Just like one faculty, let's say the sensitive appetite, can have variously different passions, joy, sorrow, hatred, desire, etc., yet all within the one appetite, one habit can extend to many variously different things, yet remain one in itself, and it remains one precisely by having one formal object. Consider again the intellectual habit of understanding. It can extend to the principle of non-contradiction, to the principle of sufficient reason, multiple things, but under the one aspect of being a principle in human knowledge. The example the Gilby Summa will give is elephants and lines of verse both fall within the scope of the science of arithmetic insofar as they both can be counted. So a habit remains one in the above example because its formal object or aspect is one, numbers, being able to be counted, even if materially, and that's our philosophical word here, lines and elephants are definitely different things. In Aquinas' words in response to this article, just as a power, while it is one, extends to many things insofar as they have something in common, i.e. some general objective aspect, so also a habit extends to many things insofar as they are related to one, for instance, to some specific objective aspect, or to one nature, or to one principle. And with that, we move on to question 55 of the virtues as to their essence. Article 1, whether human virtue is a habit. And it looks like this article is less about restating what we've already covered on this topic, but about knocking down possible objections to what we have covered, which I will refer the listener to the text if they're interested in. But in simple response to our article, St. Thomas writes, the rational powers, which are proper to man, are not determinate to one particular action, but are inclined indifferently to many, and they are determinate to acts by means of habits, as is clear from what we have said. Therefore, human virtues are habits. Article 2, whether human virtue is an operative habit. This article is meant to distinguish human virtue from entative habits like health or sanctifying grace. These are qualities which are directed primarily to nature or the subject itself and less to action or operation. And Aquinas does a great job of spelling out here how the human virtues, even if directed to operation, still affect the subject of which they are housed in. So in this way, still have an entative kind of similarity, because as we know, act follows being. And in his words, virtue, inasmuch as it is a suitable disposition of the soul, is like health and beauty, which are suitable dispositions of the body. But this does not hinder virtue from being a principle of operation. So in response to our article, human virtue is a perfection of a power of man, which then leads to good action and therefore can be called an operative habit. Article 3, whether human virtue is a good habit. In a word from St. Thomas, Augustine says no one can doubt that virtue makes the soul exceedingly good. And the philosopher says, virtue is that which makes its possessor good and his work good likewise. Article 4 in our last article, whether virtue is suitably defined. And here is that definition from Augustine. Virtue is a good quality of the mind by which we live righteously, of which no one can make bad use, which God works in us without us. First of all, this is a good definition for the infused virtues, theological virtues such as faith, hope, and charity, which are infused by God, and we will discuss later in the Summa. And so St. Thomas tells us that if you drop that last part, which God works in us without us, then we have a suitable definition for the virtues in general. So breaking down that definition, first it says, virtue is a good quality of the mind. This is to distinguish operative virtue from entative virtues, such as health, for example, which have to do with the body and not action. It also highlights that virtue and vice stem from our rational nature and are not to be found in irrational creatures whose action is determined by nature. Second, it says, by which we live righteously, because that is exactly what virtue does. It determines our actions to be in accord with our nature by being just or giving ourselves and others what is right and due. Lastly, it says, that of which no one can make bad use of, to distinguish these virtues from habits which can be used for evil. One could use their scientific knowledge for evil or their physical health for evil. And then speaking to the last part of this definition, which God works in us without us, St. Thomas says, infused virtue is caused in us by God without any action on our part, but not without our consent. This is the sense of the words, which God works in us without us. And to those things which are done by us, God causes them in us, yet not without action on our part, for he works in every will and in every nature. And with that, we come to a close of another episode. We have just finished covering questions 54 and 55 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the distinction of habits and of the virtues as to their essence. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.